Yeah, I wondered if you could maybe give some sort of more specific details on the different impacts on the kind of, the four main species groups that that you sell, because obviously some of them are coming from closer to the UK, others rely on freight, and I guess there's different kind of maybe dynamics for all of them, and I just wonder whether you could give a kind of a brief summary of how this perfect storm is impacting kind of each of these four groups.
Yeah, I mean, it is quite varied. I mean, we've seen, and if you take tuna as an example, which is a big area for us, we did see a lot of pressure on tuna raw material availability really start to hit us about 4 or 5 months ago, where combination of Japanese demand through the pandemic as people, went back to eating more as families, some of those traditional habits that had perhaps been waning, younger people out eating McDonald's instead of sushi while they were back at home having, sushi with their families. And so there was a rise in tuna consumption, but at the same time there was a decline in some of the volumes being landed. Many of the boats, for COVID reasons as well, couldn't get out fishing. So you saw this kind of real kind of tightening of the market, which inevitably drove up raw material costs. So that's been an area that we've been facing into. Whitefish, I mean, you've spoken to many other far bigger players in the whitefish sector, so you'll understand the combination of quota cuts and demand is putting pressure on those prices, and we'd expect that to play out in sort of 2022 pricing dynamics. Exact levels to which we'll find out. Areas like Turkey and which is a big producer of sea bass and bream, of course, things like energy costs drive up the cost of production. But actually, some of these processes are still quite labour intensive as well. And what's really interesting is the more you understand about the labour dynamics, it's not just the UK, it's not just other sort of Western developed countries. Actually, there's many other countries in all sorts of, socio-economic kind of spheres who are effectively all reporting similar challenges, that actually just big parts of the labour force have effectively stepped away. Now, whether that's for now, whether they come back into the labour markets, I guess remains to be seen. But those dynamics in an area like sea bass processing would put pressure on the cost. So it's kind of in multiple areas. There's not too many areas at the moment where we're seeing.
Yeah, there's no relief really, is there? There's usually been, I'd say, there's usually obviously been some area where there's been some relief, but it doesn't seem like that's the case at all at the minute.
That's usually been the dynamic, where you might get pressure on one or two of the species, and then you can get another coming back. The wild salmon was despite some relatively good catches this season, pricing really didn't ease because there's just been a really insatiable demand for high quality fish in the US market, and some of the supply chains that might previously have kept some downward pressure on some of these more premium raw materials, like the material that comes out of the Far East. Those just-in-time supply chains, the people that used to operate on 4 weeks of inventory and keep the pipeline coming, they can't rely on those supply chains anymore. And indeed, I think many customers are questioning, do we want to have supply chains that are wholly dependent on long chains like that? Because models that were seamless for a period of, a decade plus have been kind of really thrown into question. And the carnage of which containers are where, and sort of how the global shipping industry is kind of in some places almost ground to a halt is quite frightening and disconcerting if you're reliant upon continuous supply of food for your customers.
Yeah, it's I guess you're in a good position to not be too dependent on this kind of stuff. The reprocessing industry in Asia, and which has obviously been really impacted by that.
We're not directly dependent, but what you find is even container movements, the right containers and being in the right ship, things like the -60, we haven't been without some impact there, but fortunately we have managed to stay in supply thus far. So
yeah, and you obviously built up a good inventory position, which is shown in the accounts, wasn't it? That you obviously went into 2021 with a lot more inventory than you would normally have, from what I read.
We did, and that was very deliberate, based on Brexit and some of the uncertainties. And I think if there's one area where we and our owners are taking the view. It's that actually, yeah, we've got many other challenges to circumnavigate together, some of these inflationary pressures, but we want to be able to give a very clear commitment to our customers. And also, if you're carrying that cost, you have to make sure you've got products in your factories that we will keep them absolutely in supply of fish. It sounds like the most basic of promises, but all the things that perhaps we and others have taken for granted over the last decade, you can no longer take for granted, given the number of shocks to the system that are kind of going on at the moment. So